You're listening to Political by Design. I'm Leslie Clarke, the host, and this podcast is all about unpacking the stories and strategies that shape today's politics. I'm joined by Sebastian Salek, a councillor, a former political journalist and commentator on how Labour is fixing Britain. Today we're going to talk about the government's restart, why political successes often get lost in translation, and whether a new deputy leader can help turn this around. Hi Sebastian, so good to have you here on Political by Design. We have a lot to talk about. The world's gone mad, basically. We have a struggling Labour government, at least this is what it seems. And we have the time of, it's September the 17th. We have the beginning of Trump's historic second state visit. And before we dive in, I have a quick question. So last night before I went to bed, I just scanned the news and I noticed that, Trump was landing in the early evening and a group of protesters, I think, gathered around Windsor Castle, and they projected a photo of Epstein and Trump onto Windsor Castle. And I think amidst all the Epstein scandals and Peter Mandelson and the sort of the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, could the timing be any worse for Labour right now? I mean, the whole timing of the state visit.
Yeah, it's certainly an uncomfortable coincidence, and I say that in the sense of an incidence of two happenings there, that we have the Mandelson story playing out, and then we have Trump arriving, and we just have to hope that it goes without a hitch. Certainly, Trump doesn't want to talk about it. The Starmer doesn't want to talk about it. And the King doesn't want to talk about it either. So nobody from the top is going to volunteer anything on that topic. It's only going to become an issue if journalists start putting those difficult questions to those newsmakers. We have to hope that for international relations' sake, that it goes without a hitch, that it all goes well, and that our special relationship, which is really important, no matter who the president or the prime minister are, is maintained. Now, that isn't to say that the Epstein stuff isn't really, really horrible, and those who have done bad things have to face justice, and I really hope that will play out in the correct way. But from a short-term geopolitical sense, you kind of want to hope that everybody gets through this, and then we can have a proper conversation about the details of that case.
I basically just threw this question at you before I gave you the opportunity to actually introduce yourself. So this was like a little warm up. But you joined me this morning for a reason, because you are a Labour councillor. You are a previous political journalist. And I just want to give you a bit of room to basically introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, let's take it right back. So I was at Bloomberg for many years. So I was covering politics, but I was also covering business and finance and all of the things you'd expect Bloomberg to cover. And in the end, all of those things intertwined because Brexit happened. That was very important for the economy and for markets, but it was also important for you and me as British citizens and residents and everybody else. So all of those things really came together, and I was very lucky to present a radio show on Bloomberg, interviewing MPs and everybody else during those times and during COVID as well. And for a first-time radio presenter, it was fantastic because I had no idea what I was doing, but neither did they, because everything was so new that it was a really even playing field and a good learning opportunity for me. I left journalism to stand as a councillor in my community. So I'd got into community work a few years before in the lead up to the pandemic, and it's a slippery slope. Once you get into that, you find new ways to serve your community and to be a tighter part of all of that. And so I was elected in 22, and I'm going to finish my term in 26, so next May. So I've got about, 6 to 9 months, I can't count, left. And doing increasingly more writing, increasingly more broadcasting, especially as this Labour government plays out. There's a lot that people aren't talking about. And there's a lot of positives as well that I think aren't getting a fair hearing. So I'm spending a lot of time talking about those and getting them in front of the people that need to hear them.
I was going to say, I mean, if people take a look at your X account, you are trying, I think, on a daily basis. You try to explain and unpick what the government achieves and is trying to do, which is so important because the news really doesn't get out there anymore. It's overshadowed by a perceived reality, by fake news and all the noise you have on social media, and you probably will know. I mean, I used to be a Labour councillor back in the days, and I think one of the learnings I took away is once you're in the system, it is incredibly hard to get your message out. For whatever reason, it feels 10 times harder than when you are in actual campaigning mode and you knock on doors. So the government has now started its, I think, second phase, or they call it reboot, restart. What is this all about? What can you explain what the government tries to do now in this second phase?
Yeah, so first phase, the government will say, was about laying the foundations. It's about publishing all the bills that it needs to publish, or at least a large chunk of them, and getting those through the process, and the initial budget as well, which, as it saw, was about taking the reins. Basically, it's your first fiscal event after coming into government, and you can make the changes that you need to make to lay the groundwork. Its second phase it sees as building on that. So then it gets into the detail, and we're going to start to see a lot of those bills become law. Things like workers' rights, renters' rights, giving these people more rights than they've ever really had, to be honest. And these are people that are everywhere. If you have a job, if you rent, these are relevant to you. But then also shepherding the economy through to a new phase. And that's really hard because there's only so much control any chancellor has over the state of the economy. As we've seen with Trump, thunderbolts can come out of the sky and you just have to deal with them, and you have no choice over that. So it's about saying, okay, the first phase is out of the way, but this is a multi-part project. And I think that's what the really important thing is to remember here. No government of any colour could have come in and fixed the economy within a day, a week, a month, a year. This has to be a long-term project. And fortunately, Labour does have 5 years in government at least to do that. So I think that's what I'm really thinking about, and what I'm taking a lot of solace from is that the time exists for this to play out. Of course, we can't know what's going to happen in the next 4 or so years until the next general election, but that is crucial runway to do any of this. Being in government is like trying to turn an oil tanker, and you really have to take a patient approach. I can understand why people want change much more quickly. I don't really think we've recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. People have been hurting for 15, 16, 17 years now, and they're desperate for some kind of sign that things are going to get better. I think that's also the reason why a lot of voters gambled on Brexit. They gambled on Boris Johnson. They're really trying anything they can because the status quo they thought wasn't great to begin with. So what I really want to see happen is that Labour can prove that they are the answer to this, that they can bring about the change that is needed, and I think that will do a lot to restore faith in the party, and also deliver on the contract that was made. People voted for change. Now they need to see it.
You are absolutely right to say, the projects Labour wants to get done. The sort of mission that was set out probably takes more than one parliament to actually, that people see and feel that things are actually changing. The issue is the Tories had 14 years to fall out of favour. Labour managed to do that within 12 months. do you think, or what, from your perspective, what is needed to turn this around, especially when you look at the almost impossible task that Labour is threatened from the left, the new Corbyn Party, the Green Party is doing incredibly well, and then obviously Reform.
Yeah, we have to remember what a poll is. It's a snapshot of what would happen if there were an election today. And the reality is there isn't an election today. There isn't going to be an election for 4 years. Now, that's not to say that we should ignore the polls, pretend they don't exist, and just crack on with governing. Of course, there is a warning sign there, and that has to be heeded to, and it is being heeded to. You're seeing the government make concessions. To certainly on immigration, there is a lot of understanding that it's a really desperate issue for many people. Whether they're affected by it or not, they care about it, and therefore the government has to listen to them, and it is listening to them. And I'm pleased because it's the democratic thing to do. It's much like Brexit. Many of us wished Brexit had never happened, but it was the right thing to do because it was what people had voted for. That said, there is now this period where we have to see Labour win back the public. Now, I think that will happen slowly. I think also Keir Starmer is a man who is serially underestimated. You look back to 2021, I think a lot about the Hartlepool by-election, where we all thought he was going to resign. He thought he was going to resign because he'd been in as the leader of the opposition for, what was it, about a year by that point, and things had gone terribly for him. Yet, fast forward 3 years later, and there he was winning a historic majority. So I certainly wouldn't rule out a similar turnaround in government. It's very easy to work with what you've got, to work with the very, very short term, and to conclude that everything is finished. But I think that would be really silly, especially given we have that historic precedent.
You touched on something that is, I just thought about this really crucial by-election a few years ago, and it seemed to be a turning point for Starmer, most definitely. I think his confidence grew after that by-election, and really got him into a campaigning mode. And there is something about him. And you quite rightly say people underestimate him, because if you look at what Labour has done already, it seemed to be quite a radical government, even though they can't convince people that they are. But when you look at the action, I mean, we have GB Energy that was introduced straight away. Trains are about to go back into public ownership, which is a massive change. Local government reorganisation, which is most definitely will impacting people's lives. What do you think is necessary for Labour to communicate these successes? Because it seems like people don't see all of this and feel Labour is worse, is as bad or worse as the previous government, which objectively, if you look at the facts, probably isn't true.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those big projects, you really have to allow the benefits to bear out. So it isn't going to be enough for most voters to say, "Hey, look, we're renationalising the trains," or "We are building this nationally, publicly owned energy company," because they're rightfully going to say, "So what? What does that mean for me?" It's only once you can say, "Oh, and look, your train actually runs on time now. You're not delayed getting into work every day," or "Oh, and your energy bills have come down. We're less reliant on foreign energy now," that you can really sell that as a win. So again, it comes back to this idea of time, because nobody is going to set up a state-run energy company in a year. You're going to need those years to pass by for that to become really tangible and really effective. And I hope that by the next general election, we are going to see those coming through. And that's why I really think we need to take a long-term view on that. And by the way, I think this is the biggest mistake that we make in politics. We never extend the timeline far enough in both directions. You can look back and learn so much from the past, but also just think about how things are going to play out in months and weeks to come. We spend a lot of time, I was asked constantly last week about whether Starmer was too slow to sack Peter Mandelson. And God forbid we get into that discussion again. But my answer was, So what if he was? If he got it wrong by a few hours in a week's time, in a month's time, is that really going to matter? The fact is he did it, and that is what is going to have the lasting impact. So if I say anything today, it's let's always think about how we can extend the timelines, because it gives us a much better understanding of what might play out and what really are the important decisions to make today that are going to bear fruit in the future.
There's definitely, I think, a tendency among sort of Westminster professionals, the media, insiders to be focused on these details, and I agree they don't matter as much. We think they are, but they don't. Extending the timeline or the time frame, I really like the idea. If we try and do that right now, what do you think is the sort of narrative Labour tries to get across? The election campaign was grouped under change. That was the one-word slogan. Has that changed at all, or has it moved into something, morphed into something else?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because as soon as you campaign for change and get elected, you then become the status quo because you are the government in power. And so it will be quite reasonable for the Greens or for Reform to campaign on a change platform now. And indeed, to a certain extent, they are. They all have their radical ideas. However, sensible or workable we think they are by the by, really. But you then have that difficulty that change, it means changing away from you. So I think what the challenge has to be now from a messaging perspective is to get the right messages in front of the right people. So for example, there are lots of workers' rights reforms that are going through Parliament at the moment that when you poll them are incredibly popular with Reform voters, and it's really surprising stuff. I'll pull them up. I was looking at them earlier. It's things like giving workers protection from unfair dismissal from day one. 64% of Reform voters, almost two-thirds, support that idea. Making it easier to have flexible working patterns. Again, 65% of Reform voters. And these are things that Nigel Farage and the rest of Reform in Parliament have consistently voted against. So it's about showing up those instances where if you're thinking of voting Reform, but you want these kinds of workers' rights reforms, changes, we should say, probably shouldn't muddle our language there. Nigel Farage and his gang aren't the party for you because they are not aligned with you on this issue. And similarly, it's hard because when you're the government, of course, people think you're going to say everything that you do is brilliant. That is baked in, that is expected. So, from a messaging perspective, you have a real challenge. And what I'd like to see is the government, and they are doing this to an extent already, I don't know quite the details, of working with influencers and other people who have the ear of ordinary voters to be able to share some of those messages themselves. And it's not shoving ideas down your throat or promoting them or anything like that. It's just, and I'm going to use a word I hate here. If you are, for example, a mummy blogger, it might be mentioning that you've got 30 hours extra free childcare and what you're doing about that. It doesn't have to be a party political broadcast. It's just mentioning that that is the case. And hearing that from a trusted figure, I think, goes a long way. So I'd love to see that transition happen. Politics is famously really behind the curve, always on technology and on these kinds of trends. But there is so much obsession to what the papers say. How many people buy a newspaper anymore? If we're reading papers online, we're reading a huge number of newspapers. You don't have that tribal affiliation that you perhaps used to have. And as I say, I'm glad that Labour has started to do this, and I'd really like to see that mature as a project within the Number 10 comms team, because I think that's where a lot of minds will be changed.
Reform basically plays Trump's MAGA's playbook in some regards to really get the message across. Play these algorithms, and I just on a related note, I was listening to an episode of The Rest of Politics yesterday, and they basically discussed how biased some of these platforms actually are. So even though you engage with, let's say, a Green Party content or Labour content or progressive content in general, you still get right-wing messages, reform posts, reform-related influencers. You still see them. I still see them in my X feed, even though I don't necessarily engage with that sort of content. So, do you think that should be a focus for the years to come? To really try and unlock social media in a way to get the right messages in front of the right people, as you said earlier.
Yeah, I mean, look, social media is definitely a tool. I think I haven't seen polling on this, but even if you ask friends anecdotally, the number who say I get the majority of my news from TikTok or Instagram is really staggering. And I think a lot of older people who maybe didn't, weren't born as digital natives and don't have that tendency would be really surprised to hear that. What I also think we get wrong is this idea that only negative content cuts through, and there's this general idea that the algorithm amplifies anger or outrage or anything like that. I read a book recently called what's it called? It's by Jonah Berger. It's really good. It's about what goes viral. It's called Contagious, and it's a little bit old. It was written over a decade ago, and he originally went through and looked at the I think it was the Wall Street Journal. It was one of the US papers, and looked at what was most read and what was most shared. And he was trying to work out what makes something shared rather than just read. And one of the things he looked at was emotion. And his finding was that we share positive things much more than we share negative things because we feel something. We feel something good. We want to share that good feeling with other people. And it's something that I found as well in the work that I do. I write threads on X and on God, we can't call it X now, on Twitter, let's be honest.
Yeah, yeah.
On threads on Blue Sky multiple times a week, and I don't, I try to be positive because I want to put forward a positive view for our country. I want to be an optimist. That's who I am inherently. And I see those messages doing really well. And I think political leaders would do well to remember that too, that we should be able to share our successes and not worry about trying to dunk on our opponents all the time because it doesn't make me look great. I know it's kind of expected for politicians to do that, but I would like to see a culture that is talking a little bit more about what's going really well, rather than him over there who's getting it wrong.
And your positive outlook and what you're trying to do on Twitter is actually backed by data. I mean, if you look at the data, and especially Gen Z. Gen Z was long believed the sort of generation of the left. That's not true. We have two Gen Zs, if you will. One is the one group is actually leaning more towards the left, but there's also a significant group of Gen Zs who have conservative tendencies, leaning strongly towards the right. But both of those groups have something in common, and they want positive. They seek a positive outlook on life, which doesn't really sort of how Reform and in America MAGA communicates. That doesn't really match because everything you hear from Reform and MAGA is quite negative, isn't it? I can't recall a positive message. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're right. There was another thing though that I think MAGA does get right, and particularly Trump gets right, and we can learn a lot from. And it's something that I try to do in everything that I write. And it's using simple language. It really is that basic, and it's just making sure that you are easy to scan in the feed, or you're easy to watch. And I think back to a time when we were talking about manifestos and whether there should be a simple language manifesto. And the idea is that it's for non-native speakers and anybody else whose English isn't at the stage where they can get through a normal manifesto. And my view on this is that all manifestos should be simple language manifestos, because even if you're native born, incredibly intelligent, you can read War and Peace with your eyes shut, you're still going to be grateful to have something put in front of you that is easy to digest. You're going to be busy. You're going to have all of this other information competing for your attention, and you need to be able to read and retain that. And you look at, again, the studies done on Trump's language, and the reading grade he's at is so low. And I think we can all take a lot from that. And time I sit down to write a thread, I'm always thinking, okay, how can I make sure that somebody on first reading can understand everything that I'm saying? And so quite often what I'm doing is just taking information that exists elsewhere and translating it into plain English. It's what I do with my newsletter as well, where I explain the bills that are going through Parliament in plain English. And again, it's just taking the explanatory notes that the House of Commons or that Parliament puts out, and turning that into language that anybody can understand. And I think a lot of that for me goes back to my days in financial journalism, where, oh my God, everything is so gate kept. There's so much language that you have to be in the know to understand. And I think it's a reason why not enough people are investing, for example, because we think all this information is very scary and we don't want to get involved. And what could be more important to get involved with than our own democracy, than our own politics? And if politicians, maybe through no awareness of their own, are willingly shutting people out because they're not using accessible enough language, that is a real problem.
Language is incredibly important, and I caught myself when I was elected. I put on these like this typical politician talk, and you do that. I think for several reasons. Is one of the reasons politicians talk in the way they talk that they want to protect themselves? Because I feel
100%.
I mean, there's a long history of politicians stumbling over their words. The media is really, really trying to unpick everything they say. Do you think there is a protection element to it?
Completely. And it goes way beyond politics. Look at any industry, look at any community, and people conform because go back 1,000 years, we've all got cavemen brains. What happened if you didn't conform? You were ostracized. What happened if you were ostracized? It meant certain death. So we are still thinking like that, even though we may be performing as community leaders, as politicians, or as CEOs or anything else. I've started thinking about a framework where before you get involved in something new, you look at what's going on and you think, okay, what are all the traps I might fall into? What are all the behaviors I might adopt? How might I want to do this differently? And look, I'm as bad at this as anybody else, but I think one place I've got it right is on Twitter, because the kind of content that I'm putting out, I just didn't see anywhere else. And it felt like a bit of a risk. I thought people might shout at me or criticize me. And what's worse than being criticized by your own peers and people who think the same as you and people who go to the same meetings and events as you? But that paid off. And now I'm trying to apply that to other areas of my life. And look at the politicians who've done that. It's people like Boris Johnson, the complete anti-politician, came in, didn't say any of those things. And when he does say them, when he uses a turn of phrase that a politician might use, it's with a cheeky wink. It's with that acknowledgement of, oh, look, I'm pretending to be this kind of person, but that's not really who I am. And that was a big part of his success. Trump as well is the obvious one, who's just come in and been himself. And I think, yes, that's kind of a risk, but it's a bit like when people say starting your own business is a risk. Actually, I'll argue the bigger risk is staying and conforming and doing your existing role. And that's the same for politicians. If you're going to be kind of a career politician, at least be yourself. Don't hide behind this mask. You will go so much further. It feels counterintuitive. It feels dangerous, but the upside is so much bigger for you.
Do you believe there's an unfair advantage looking at figures like Trump, Johnson, Farage, who get away with seemingly loose language, simple language, jokes that probably couldn't be made by someone on the left? Do you think there's an unfair advantage that, those people get away with far more than, for example, Angela Rayner, who, some people on the right still talk about that scum statement she made. So I feel it seems like, from my perspective, it seems like there's an unfair advantage.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right about that. The left are always held to a higher moral standard, but to an extent, we also hold ourselves to a higher moral standard because we are the people who believe in doing the right thing, in fairness, in equality, in looking after each other. Whereas conservatives would quite happily admit they're about individualism and empowering the individual to go ahead and succeed. I think that just naturally attracts more people who would describe themselves as not PC to the right. and therefore you have a bigger base of people who you can make that kind of joke to. I don't really know how that will play out on the left. I'd be interested to see a candidate try that, and I wonder if there is an example around the world of just a very straight talking left wing leader. Um, but I think left wing voters expect more from their politicians. They expect them to uphold these moral values. You know, if you take it to the complete extreme, you can see what happens with people like Corbyn, who has to maintain this moral purity, which actually I think impedes a lot of your decision making because you're always thinking about that first and you're not grounded in the real world and the challenges you have in front of you. So, yeah, I mean, look, it is a conundrum. I would love to see somebody try it just to see how it would play out. But maybe there's a reason that nobody's done that yet on the left, and you do have many more of those figures on the right who feel able to make the risque joke, to say the slightly edgy thing, and clearly come away largely unscathed. All the people we're talking about, Farage, Trump, Johnson, have had extremely successful careers and have got to the top of where they've tried to get to. So, yeah, I don't know. With the same work on the left, we just don't know yet.
Could Newsom be someone who, because I mean, looking at how he pivoted and tried to not mimic, but probably troll Trump in a way that is really effective. Do you think he could be the one making it acceptable for people on the left to go down a similar path?
Yeah, he's a really good example, isn't he? And you have to wonder how much mileage that trolling has. I wonder whether it's really a long-term strategy. It's certainly cut through as a funny thing that seems to really annoy Trump. But I wonder whether that might give other politicians license to try something like that. What does that do though to the state of our politics? If we're drawn into that kind of name calling, taking the Mickey, winding each other up culture, is that really the politics we want to have? I think a lot of left wing people might quite rightly say, look, you're falling below the standards we expect of our leaders. So there's got to be a middle ground where you can cut through somehow, but you don't do it in a way that is slightly churlish, slightly puerile, and is maybe not befitting of the office that you hold.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a good question. This is the question I keep asking myself since Trump got elected in 2016. I think it was 2016 when he won the election the first time. And it seems those 4 years have definitely done some damage to our political culture and how we communicate and what is expected of leaders. And I think now we're in a space where everything seems possible, but not in a positive way. So we will probably need to reassess where we are in terms of culture, language, what is expected or what is possible when he leaves office.
Yes, on this, I think there's a huge cultural shift that we could be seeing in Britain based on this. And based on the kind of rhetoric and language and even policy actions that reform are importing into this country, because reform, as we know, are taking a lot of ideas from the US. And one of those is this idea that anything can be done. We just have to smash through enough barriers to get it done. You look at what Trump has done on immigration and, sending people to El Salvador and all of those things. It's been really iron fisted, but it's worked. And what that's done is given reform a model. And I think they took a lot of inspiration from that when they introduced their own immigration plans, sending women back to the Taliban and all of those things that seem unthinkable to us, but they're saying they will do it. And I think that flies in the face of one of the few British values that we can truly say is a British value. We talk about this concept a lot, and we always come back to fairness and equality and all of those things that I think other countries could quite rightly lay claim to as well. But the one that really stands out to me is a sense of fair play. You think about queuing. We all do it, and we do it despite the fact that it is not most advantageous to us as individuals. If you wanted to jump the queue, that would save you some time. I've spent enough time in the queue at Lidl snaking around the back of the bakery thinking about all the time I'm losing, but I stay there, and we all do, because it's the right thing to do and it maintains this kind of tacit social contract. And even you look at some of the parts of our constitution are held together by these conventions. The idea that if you are in the House of Lords, you don't vote down something that was in the manifesto. If you are the monarch, you don't refuse to enact a law, to give royal assent to a law that you don't like. None of this is written down in law. You won't be sent to prison if you don't do any of this stuff. But we do this because it's the right thing to do. And I wonder whether the fact that that culture seems to be changing at the top of politics, certainly on the right, whether that filters down, and that we will do this at all costs, even though it might not be the right thing to do, as a political strategy, as a response to issues like immigration, then starts to filter down to society. And I think that would be a real shame, because that's one of the things that we, as Brits and as people who live in Britain, can really cling to as something that's very special to us.
You're right. I mean, our constitution is basically built on convention, and I'm watching the US system crumbling down. Written, I mean, it was their checks and balances are written in like it's black and white, and it didn't seem to work. So how vulnerable are we to those changes you described? Because our checks and balances, I mean, some of them are written in and have legal status, but others are just conventions, as you said. So this is definitely something to watch. I read a book the other day by surprisingly Nick Clegg, and his take on, well, his time as deputy prime minister. And it was interesting to read this because it was, I think it was published in 2017 or 2018, definitely a while ago. And the challenges he described sound pretty much what we have right now. I mean, he described a politics that gets more and more radical. He described a sort of a dying political center. Everything sort of pushes to the fringes, and that certainly hasn't stopped. I think the pandemic actually was accelerating this trend to a certain degree. But there was something in there I found interesting, and he said that there are only a couple of moments, snapshots, where people are actually listening. Those snapshots are usually when you get into power. Then when midterm, hopefully it is midterm, hopefully it never comes, but you have some kind of scandal, something that is maybe overblown, written up, but it is perceived a scandal. And then obviously when you enter your re-election campaign. Those three moments he described as snapshot moments. Obviously, Labour had a snapshot moment when Starmer entered number 10 and gave this incredibly like doom and gloom speech. And people remember that till this day. Do you think the deputy leader election campaign, or hopefully then when the new deputy leader gets elected and we know who it is, do you think this could be another snapshot moment for Labour to reset their narrative, to get a different message across, because people will most definitely be listening?
I'm sceptical about that, about whether the deputy leadership election really cuts through with the public. I think we have to be honest about just how little most people who aren't like you and me obsessed with politics take in from the conversation. I speak to family members about this kind of stuff, and I kind of poll them because they're really good arbiters of this kind of thing. They don't live in London, they're not obsessed with politics, and I'm always keen to see what are you taking in and what are you seeing. For me, the deputy leadership election is more an internal thing, and one of the core skills I want to see from a deputy leader is how well can you manage the party. The Labour Party is really broad, and that's a really good thing. But with that breadth comes a challenge. You have to make sure that everybody is on board, and that's even harder given how many MPs Labour has at the moment. More than 400 people who all have their own careers to think about. They all have their own issues they care about, and somebody has to corral all of those. And one of the things that I think Angela Rayner did really well was cut through to those different groups. And so that's what I want to see from the next leader. Now, I was looking at some Labour list polling on the kind of the extent to which different factions within Labour are backing different contenders, either the contenders. I can see that Bridget Phillipson seems to have a lead among lots of these different groups: the Cooperative Party, Get Britain Working, Labour Growth Group, Labour Movement for Europe. And that's really reassuring because I think she can be someone who comes in and has those conversations. And we're seeing her do it already with the special educational needs reforms. She had those conversations very early on with MPs, sounded them out, gave them an opportunity to share their thinking on some really difficult reforms. So she's kind of proven in that sense as well. But look, I would hope that anybody, either of the candidates who win, are able to do that, because that's what we really need as a party. Because if you don't have your own house in order, how can you then go to the country and expect them to take you seriously? So that is one of the really key skills we need right at the top of the Labour Party at any time, but most importantly when we're in government.
How crucial do you think this skill of coalition building will be for the new deputy leader? Because looking at the north, there is definitely a threat. Most definitely, the most important sort of fight to have is against reform. Then you look at areas like Manchester, Bristol, Brighton, the city where I live, known for its green tendencies and having elected the first Green MP some years ago. How important do you think is coalition building? Because as important as the fighting of reform is, there is definitely some, well, I think, different strategy to be applied to areas like Brighton or Bristol.
Yeah, definitely. And it goes back to what I was saying about getting the right message in front of the right people. And coalition building is important at every election. And it really was last time around as well. I remember speaking to people who are close to the Prime Minister now, and they were outlining the areas they needed to win. And it was, the university towns, it was the Red Wall, it was Scotland, and it was one other. I think it might have been the Blue Wall, I can't remember. But these are really disparate places with different people who have different outlooks on life, and being able to craft a message that can really hit home with all of them is incredibly difficult. And I think the answer really is it's lots of different messages, but then that has to come together as a coherent package as well. Yes, it's going to be a challenge. It's even harder when you're in government, when you have a record, when you have decisions you've made that you need to be able to justify to people. So I think, if anything, it's going to be even more of a challenge this time round, just because of that track record. But it becomes no less important. And I think the Labour Party is well positioned to do that. You've seen the rise of Blue Labour, for example, which talks to people on the right. But then there are also many people within Labour who, you've got a Labour-run council in Brighton. So clearly the message is getting through with people down there who also would have. Many of them voted for a Green MP, so you're seeing people kind of on the fringes towards the left that way. But it's just a case of how do you put all that together and package it up into something that really speaks to people, and that is where the messaging challenge comes through.
Do you think conference will be a pivotal moment for the government?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of pressure on Starmer for his speech. It's got to be realistic. It's got to address where we are now. It can't be all sunshine and rainbows, but it also has to give hope. I think you always have a choice about how to govern. It's either hope or fear. And I think on the left, we often rightly choose hope. And I really want to see that continue. More importantly, though, I think conference is coming at a really good time. We do need to have a conversation as a party. We need to take stock after, what will it be, 15 months? And what better chance than an event where any of us as Labour members can go and sit and share ideas with people right at the top of government. And I know they will be in listening mode as they sit on those panels and as they make those speeches and as they mill around in the bars and in the reception rooms, because that is what we are as a party. We are a we are abundant in our ideas. I'd love to see the marketplace of ideas do its thing and JSville work is magic and the best ones float to the top and we take them to the country. So yeah, a really good time to be having that kind of conversation, but also with the understanding that we have many more years in government. This isn't one of those opposition conferences that we're so used to as a party where you're trying to come up with the ideas to take to the country to convince them to give you a chance. This is more, okay, we're here now, what are we going to do? And so we have to remember that it is a very different backdrop as well.
One question on Labour as a brand, because politics is, and this is the reason why I started this podcast, because I think, branding and politics is intertwined. Nowadays you can't have a successful election campaign if you don't think about your branding and your messaging and all of these elements. Looking at other parties and how they're organized in Europe, social democratic parties, do you think there would be value to reform how Labour works internally? Could there be an advantage to say you have a party leader that is not an MP and not Prime Minister, to be more rooted in communities and do that kind of work? Or do you think it is important to maintain the structure we have at the moment? I mean, in order to become a more effective machine in government in these changed times, wouldn't there be a value to reassess how Labour works internally?
I think that's kind of what the deputy leader does. I mean, if you think about Angela Rayner, that was literally her brief, communities. And you are someone who is just a little bit freer to go and do those things. And that's why you need those very deep interpersonal skills where you can connect with people because you're talking to ordinary voters all the time. You're not holed up in Downing Street making policy and making difficult calls every day. So yeah, that kind of already exists. I think another case study that we have, and we'll see how he plays out, is Zach Polanski, who is now a party leader but not an MP. He's a London Assembly member, and
True.
how well will that go down with left-leaning voters who are flirting with the Greens, who see somebody who isn't working in Parliament and isn't. Didn't even go for a seat last time. So we kind of have a real life example of that. So far, I don't think it's doing him too much damage. I don't think it's really going to be an issue. It'll be interesting to see whether he does go for a seat next time. I think probably his term on the London Assembly will have ended and he'll have a bit more flexibility. But I think for a national party where you have a prime minister like Labour, you've got that heritage, you've got that heft, you've got all of your MPs, to have your prime minister not be an MP or to have your party leader not be an MP would be really odd. And I think you'd have a hard time explaining that to the country.
Lastly, I think you said early on that polling obviously isn't reliable. It's just a snapshot of really right now, and we don't have an election right now. It's in a few years' time. Are there any other metrics, anything where we could that would allow us to measure success and to know that Labour is on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, this is still polling, but I look a lot at the best prime minister polls because I think there's rarely been a party leader become prime minister without leading in those polls. And fortunately, Starmer is still ahead against any party leader, including Nigel Farage. And that, I think, is one of the real issues for reform, which is that, yeah, the party may be doing well, but under the surface, there are a lot of issues. And I wrote about this recently. They are not trusted. The majority of voters do not trust reform on any issue that YouGov has polled them on. And they polled them on, maybe about 10, 15 issues, including, surprisingly, I was shocked by this, immigration. A majority of voters do not trust reform to deliver on immigration. Crucially, they don't trust them on the economy. And they don't see Farage as somebody who could be party leader. Now, look, Farage has the benefit of time as well. He also has 4 odd years to turn that around, to look more prime ministerial. And we're certainly seeing him try to do that with the big union, Jack Drake behind him at his conference and speeches.
Yeah.
But in terms of metrics that Labour could look at, I gravitate towards the economy, but we're talking about what are people really feeling. So it's things like real wage growth, which we've had largely since about 2023, but we hadn't had since about 2008 before that. So if you, had a job in 2008, the chances are that your wages have barely kept up with your living standards. And I think that is underpinning a lot of the problems that people are having at the moment. So if I were looking at one metric, one economic metric, it would be real wage growth, to make sure that people are getting richer, not just GDP, not just the country is getting richer, people are feeling the benefit of that.
It's been really, really interesting to talk to you.
You too.
And clearly there's a lot of work ahead for the Labour movement. And it's got to be interesting times, for sure. Have a fantastic day, and I see you around.
Yeah, see you soon.
Thanks to Sebastian for joining me on Political by Design. You can follow his commentary and insights on Twitter and via his website. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and review. It really helps me reach more listeners. I'm Clarke, and I see you next time.